All right, Laura, so there's an oil refinery in Grangemouth that has been particularly important for a number of years, and they're closing it down.
They are 400 job losses as owners PetroIneos. So that's PetroChina, which is a state oil and gas investor in China, and Jim Ratcliffe of Manchester Football. Is it Man City or Man United?
Oh my God! Wait, hang on, Joel. Where is he? United.
There you go. Man United owner is the other half of that venture, and they own one of Scotland's oldest oil refineries and Scotland's last existing oil refinery, and it refines North Sea oil, which, well, I went up there and I spoke to some of the workers, and they were explaining to me that North Sea oil is really heavy. It's got very heavy minerals in it, which means that it can't be refined at any of the UK's other refineries. So there's five remaining in England now, which means it'll all have to be exported and re-imported when this refinery closes down. It also means 400 job losses to the town, which itself is almost wholly reliant on this refinery. It's the only industry in the town. Everything else there kind of exists to service it. And I've actually got a little clip from one of the workers that I spoke to there about the impact on it. Shall we play it here?
Yeah, let's go.
I think the impact of the closure of the site would have would be devastating, and I think we didn't need to look too far at other examples in the past, whether it be the coal industry, whether it be Ravenscraig and Motherwell in the 1990s. I mean, we all know what happens when these jobs go, and that is devastation. I mean, I left school coming here as an apprentice, like many local people did in the area. I mean, it's very few workplaces these days you can come from a working class community, get an apprenticeship and then earn good money in terms of conditions. So, I mean, in that sense, it's a great workplace, and that's why we're so devastated to see it potentially closing.
Okay, so there are several parts to this story, right? So we'll get to the kind of managed decline, which is what you saw when you were up there, and that's important when you're talking about it being a particularly difficult oil to refine. There's also the effect on the number of people who'll be working up there, and also their families and their subsidiaries. But there's this big question about de-industrialization, right? So Labour have announced this huge, get energy British again plan, right? And a lot of that is green energy. What kind of evidence did you find of de-industrialization while you were up there?
I think Scotland itself, like the north of England, was kind of devastatingly impacted by how the 1980s played out. And Labour have promised to do this a just transition to green energy, as they're calling it, which is very different, I think, to what you saw in Port Talbot under the Conservatives. But this just transition is taking the form of Project Willow, which is really just an investment in green energy in the area and green jobs. But the issue is that those green jobs might not appear in Grangemouth for 10 to 15 years, while the job losses are happening in spring. So you have this employment gap, which I actually spoke to the Unite Scotland secretary about, and we can insert that clip here.
Scotland has been left with wastelands before. We've seen it during what happened with the miners without proper planning, and we've been pushing both governments for a while now to say, look, you're going to have to step up, let us know what a plan is, let us know what greener jobs are. I mean, there's a green job, somebody going around in an electric bike delivering food. If that's an idea of a green job, then it's not what we think a green job should be. So we need to see proper plan, build infrastructure across the country for green and renewable jobs, but it can't be done at the expense of the current workforce. What they're talking about is, newer and greener renewable energies coming online in Grangemouth in maybe 5 years' time. What we are saying to them is in 5 years' time, you won't have the skills and knowledge and the expertise to do that. So they put in a number of different things. There's going to be funding available through the college for people to take up new jobs, but the unemployment rate in Grangemouth is so high that people won't have jobs to move into. That's the harsh reality of the situation.
So this is the sort of pattern that's playing out across Britain, and it has been playing out, well, you said since the 1980s, but it's really ramped up in the last couple of years. We've seen Port Talbot, as you mentioned, which is this Steelworks in Wales, that was closed down. That it was switched to a more greener way of creating steel, but that was at the cost of 2,000 jobs. And then looking toward Teesside, where there is now a Freeport, they were promised by the Conservatives that there was going to be this job boom. They promised 1,800 jobs. None of those have materialised yet, and that Freeport's been operating for a good couple of years. So now we're looking at Grangemouth and this area of Scotland where hundreds of jobs are about to go. What do these people do in the interim when they're not working?
I think that was one of the the things the workers were bringing up over and over again is that they are going to have to leave Grangemouth to find work, which also means by the time the green jobs do arrive, there'll be no one with the skills level to take them. So a lot of these guys, because these are very high skill, high wage jobs, which also they point out don't exist really in this part of Scotland. Like there's no other industry about. One of the guys was saying there's nowhere else you can leave school at 16, get an apprenticeship, and then be on a very high wage, over 50k within 5 years. That just doesn't exist anywhere else in that part of Scotland. So they were talking about having to move either onto the rigs in the North Sea, but then saying in 5 years' time, because there's no more licensing, that we could be facing the same situation again. Or they were saying we're going to have to move out to the Middle East, out to Saudi Arabia, these sorts of countries, which a lot of them didn't really want to bring their families over there. So they were kind of facing this decision.
So so obviously, we'd like a green transition. That seems totally sensible, and we'd all like to move to that point. But closing down this oil refinery doesn't suddenly create green jobs. It doesn't suddenly pave the way for everyone in Britain using green energy. There's got to be some kind of interim, right? So we're going to have to import oil from somewhere else. And where are we getting that from?
I think this was one of the points that Ed Conway made, who Ollie interviewed, and that interview will be up by the time you're seeing this, if you should go and watch it after. But he made the point that we are just kind of offshoring our dirty emissions right now. We're not decreasing our reliance on fossil fuels, which also the green transition itself will require, because it's going to require a lot of plastics to make things like wind turbines, and plastics are a fossil fuel product. So these things are interrelated. You can't just shut down one and start another.
Well, this is the thing with the steel in Port Talbot that I didn't understand, because they were making this very specific type of virgin steel that is used in a lot of machinery. We're now going to have to bring that steel in from somewhere else.
Exactly. And we could become reliant on supply chains that are very, very susceptible to shocks, which could rocket the price, like we saw with the Russian invasion of Ukraine, when oil and gas prices went through the roof, and is partially responsible for the cost of living crisis, which we've all been going through. And the thing about Grangemouth being turned into an import terminal that the workers mentioned to me, and then Ed Conway in this interview brought up again, is that we're at risk of importing sanctioned Russian oil, which has been sanctioned since the invasion of Ukraine. But when this Scottish oil is sent abroad to be refined, it goes to these kind of third state refineries in places like India. And when they mix the crude oil together, they're not keeping a record of where this oil is coming from. So when we're re-importing it, we are at risk of importing sanctioned Russian oil, and by proxy, propping up the war in Ukraine.
Well, that seems like it was all worthwhile sanctioning Russia for all of that time, doesn't it?
It just doesn't feel like there's, with the closure of Port Talbot, Scunthorpe Steelworks is at risk as well, Redcar and Grangemouth, it feels like there's just kind of a lack of long-term thinking or long-term planning, or even industrial policy.
There was something very eerie about Redcar, which was just like, it was a town that was on the brink of collapse. I think that was actually quite similar to Port Talbot. Port Talbot had a lot of money in it. I mean, like one of the guys who picked me up to go and show me around the steelworks, he picked me up in a Porsche, and you're looking at this town, high street's full, it's bustling, it's got money in it. And you're thinking, oh God, in 5 years' time, there's going to be nothing here. Because I mean, you look down at places where there used to be, say, like a Ford car manufacturer. There isn't one there anymore, which means, like, in areas like Swindon, they're desolate. And that's what's going to happen in Redcar, and then that's what's going to happen in Grangemouth.
Exactly. And I think the thing about Grangemouth is it already has higher levels of unemployment and poverty than the average rate in Scotland. And you walk down its high street and it is already like desolate. There's so many closed shops, there's not much money in the town, and you're removing the only source of like high income wages to that town. And you mentioned there car manufacturing, and we saw the closure in Luton of the Vauxhall site. And this goes back to kind of my point about where is the industrial policy, because the UK is one of the only countries in Europe that doesn't tariff Chinese electrical vehicles. So that is one of the reasons why it is becoming uncompetitive for our car manufacturing industry, because we can't compete with Chinese car manufacturers, but Europe is protecting itself from this.
So what's the sell? This is probably a harder question. than I anticipated. Why would you want to close down Grangemouth? What would be the benefit of doing that?
Ultimately, it's a corporate decision from Petrowinius. The government did step in, did try and find a buyer, did try and convince them to invest more, but ultimately they just didn't want to. They said it wasn't a competitive refinery to compete with, because Grangemouth is a very old site. It would require investment to keep it up to standard, but ultimately they said they didn't want to do that because it's non-competitive to compete with these new refineries that are popping up in the Middle East, Asia and Africa.
Which is the same argument that they made about Tata Steel made about Port Talbot, right? They said we're going to make this electric blast furnace and instead the government have to pay for it. We're not going to pay for it. Mm-hmm. Great, well, good for them.
Also, these industries were all once nationalised as well.
Well, I was going to come on to that. What would be the benefit of nationalising them? It's so interesting, isn't it? Because that's sort of the push from Labour with GB Energy. The big sell that they've made to the public is you're going to own this energy once again. So you've got an area now that's not got a lot of jobs in it. It's not got a lot of opportunity. What happens to the political landscape in those areas?
It's interesting because Grangemouth until this election was an SNP stronghold, and then obviously the refinery played a big part in their election there. The Labour candidate who won, Brian Leishman, campaigned on saving the refinery and calling for nationalising the refinery, which hasn't happened. And I think that how this de-industrialisation is playing out and has played out will be one of the defining features of UK politics in the next 10 years at the next general election. Because we saw the north of England during the Brexit debate. Largely that could have been seen as a reaction to being left behind, which was a result itself of how deindustrialisation was carried out. And I wonder if we're going to see these towns like Port Talbot, like Scunthorpe, like Grangemouth, where the green transition is maybe not playing out how it should, become reactionary again in their politics, because they have been left behind. They have been left without jobs, without industry, and it does make sense you would look for an alternative because the current status quo isn't working for you. Do you think that's something that could happen as well?
Yeah, I mean, I think that's Labour's big problem, right? If you're going to focus on long-termism, which is good, you should be planning for the future, because successive Conservative administrations haven't bothered for quite some time. But what do you do in the interim? You know, we've got a five-year election cycle. What happens if in 5 years' time the green jobs aren't there, they're not available yet, but you've closed down the local refinery? Where do those people go? They're not going to go to Labour. They're going to go to a party like Reform, who can make big, bold promises. They're very good at talking to people on, you know, who feel like they have been left behind. They really do have, as you said, that kind of Brexit backing, that sort of sentiment about their policies, or their politics, actually. Policies would be a bit too grandiose, I think, some of it, with their rhetoric. I think it's quite frightening, especially if you're a young person in those towns. I don't know what happens to you. Where do you go?
I don't know. You just have to leave your town, which then leaves like a very dependent elderly population. I think, kind of finally, I'd like to plug Ollie's interview with Paul Collier, who's an economist who's written this book about left behind towns and a new set of economics for neglected places. And it's really like a plea with the Labour government to take this seriously. And he's actually, well, he claims to have coined the phrase managed decline.
Oh, does he now?
He does claim that. But it's interesting because he's saying deindustrialization happened, but then kind of the Treasury orthodoxy, this belief that the free market would create an equilibrium, compounded the effects of deindustrialization in these towns, and that the Treasury is still today refusing to learn its lesson and refusing to realise that it needs to step in and get involved. And he said, you know, the failure of the Conservatives' levelling up programme is that the Treasury didn't award it enough money. So ultimately what he's calling for is increased devolution, which Labour have agreed to, but he says that this can't just be the allocation of new powers. It has to come with funding, and it has to come with money towards these places.
Because that's what's happened in Stoke and that area, the area where they used to call the Potteries, which was sort of Jonathan Gullis's old stomping ground. There was levelling up funding that was awarded to them, and they had this big skills hub, quote unquote skills hub, to retrain people who'd worked previously in industry to get them into technological jobs. or get them working online, that sort of thing. And obviously not enough money was allocated. And also, if you can train people, but if there's not a job for them to go into afterwards, then the whole thing's redundant, right?
Exactly.
Should we listen to a bit of Paul to finish?
We should.
In terms of governance, there are about 50 people running the country, and they're pretty much all in the Treasury. And so immense amount of concentration of power in the Treasury. Now, the Treasury is not just powerful, it's socially extremely exclusive. In two layers, all of Whitehall is socially exclusive. Right? To get it to thrive in promotions in Whitehall, you need to be from a good university and a good school, right? Meaning a public school, right? There's a fascinating testimonial by a former permanent secretary. Permanent secretary's top of the pile, right? He was the top civil servant in a ministry. And he said, I felt an outsider in Whitehall. Why did this guy feel an outsider? Because although he'd been to a good university and a good public school, he hadn't been to Oxbridge, where I'm a professor, remember?
Yes. Oh, thank you. Yes, I've forgotten actually.
Yeah. So, I mean, that was astonishing that he felt an outsider just because he hadn't been to Oxbridge.
Yes.
Good God. And then it gets worse, right? Because we've now been able to measure the social composition within Whitehall. And indeed, he was an outsider because it's dominated by Oxbridge types. But the Treasury turns out to be even more socially exclusive than the rest of Whitehall. It's run like a monastery. How does monastery work, right? In case you were thinking of applying, you're a bit late to get into a monastery, right? You apply when you're a teenager, right? And to get into the Treasury, you go fast track. And fast track means you take an entrance exam, which is really for people who've just finished their master's degree. Now, it could be at Oxford, could be at Cambridge, could be at London School of Economics. One or two other places that are almost acceptable for fast track. But fast track, you go in with your first job. So you've done very well. You've got a first at the undergraduate level, then you've got a really good performing master's degree from a really good university, and then you go straight in. Right? That's fast track entrance. One characteristic you think you have is you think you're pretty clever. Right? Well, let's not mince words. You think you're very clever. Right? Many of my students, I taught in the Department of Economics as a professor for years before I moved to public policy. So a lot of my own students went straight into the Treasury.
And no doubt very clever after having been taught by you, Paul.
Absolutely, because, yes, I don't like to mention it, but so you get the message, right?
Yeah.
So the one thing these kids haven't got is any experience of doing anything. Yeah? And so they've got zero experience, but they think they're very clever. And then they're given some task by the Treasury. The Treasury obsessively scrutinizes the spending ministries, and somewhere beyond the spending ministries is the great unwashed, the local governments. Oh my God, right? And so you scrutinize them to death. Yesterday, at the Blavatnik School in Oxford, we convened about 20 people from local government. And very rapidly, they united on impassioned anger against the Treasury. Because, as they say, one had a wonderful story. He was online with 30 people from the Treasury. He was one, they were 30. What were the 30 of them doing? They were scrutinizing how he was planning growth in his city region authority. 30 of them scrutinizing him and critiquing him, and one of him. And he said, it did strike me that there was somewhat an imbalance of allocative talent here. I could have done with a lot of them, their brain power,
Yes.
helping me.
Or even the resource.
Yes, absolutely.
Yeah.
Yes,
salaries
better
at the
the
start.
resource.
Yes, indeed.
And indeed, these kids are less useful than they think they are because they haven't got any experience. And so that's the bitter reality, that these are overconfident kids who are tasked. You know, one was tasked with planning bus routes for Manchester. Had he grown up? Had he been in Manchester?
Had he taken a bus in Manchester? Yeah.
Probably not. So he might have taken a train to Manchester, except that I just was on the line with somebody from Manchester yesterday who was supposed to get to the meeting in Oxford. He said, my train is moving at 2 miles an hour, and I won't be able to get to my meeting in London and then get to Oxford. So he didn't show up. Right? But the point of that is that trying to plan bus routes in Manchester, planned by a kid in London who's no experience of anything, is bound to go wrong. That degree of micromanagement centralization, the 30 kids scrutinizing, this is madness. It cannot work.